The MBTI Step 2 Forum, Your Questions Answered. My name is Jennifer Overbo. I'm the MBTI Product Marketing Manager here at CPP, and I'm so pleased to have you join us. We received many questions from those of you who registered for today's webinar, and we crafted our entire presentation to ensure that we've answered your questions. But we'd like to encourage you to keep them coming throughout the presentation. If you have a question, go ahead and submit it in your question box. And at the end of today's webinar, if time permits, we'll ask Sherrie to answer those additional questions. Anything that goes unanswered today, fear not, we will be putting together a Q&A document and posting it to cpp.com/webinars, where you'll be able to access both this presentation as well as those additional questions answered. I'd like to welcome and introduce you to our speaker, Sherrie Haynie. Sherrie is an organizational development consultant, and she serves as a consultant here at CPP. She's an MBTI Master Practitioner and MBTI Certification Program faculty member. She currently consults with a multitude of Fortune 500 businesses of all sizes. In addition to providing MBTI certification training, she develops and facilitates OD initiatives for leadership, coaching, team building, performance management, and strategic planning. With a focus on organizational results, Sherrie previously consulted for GM, Ford Motor Company, Delta Airlines, and Wayne State University. So we're really pleased to have her here. She is an expert in Step 2. And today we're going to be covering a few different topics. We're going to go over and review, for those of you who had questions around the uses and benefits of the Step 2 assessment, to ensure that you know when it's appropriate to use it. We're going to give an overview of how you can interpret Step 2 results. We're going to answer all of your specific questions that were submitted and give you some examples to help drive those points home. We're going to explore a case study, an actual client that Sherrie worked with in the past, and work through interesting results. We're going to make sure that you understand the resources that are available to you as you continue your practice with the Step 2 instrument. And we're going to talk to you about a special promotion that we're offering today to those who are in attendance. Sherrie and as well as Pam Valencia, our other organizational consultant here at CPP, have offered to provide coaching assistance to some of the members in the audience who might be interested, just to ensure that you have what you need to continue using the Step 2 assessment or to get started if you're new to it. So without further ado, I'd like to hand the presentation over to Sherrie. Sherrie, welcome, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I look forward to working with you this morning for the next hour and answering some of the great questions that you submitted. So we'll start out with just a quick overview for those of you that are familiar and have been utilizing the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. As you know, there are two forms. The standard form, Form M, is what we consider Step 1, and it has the 93 items that generate only your Step 1 results. Form Q, which will be the focus of our topic this morning, is the Step 2 form, and it includes the 93 items from Form M as well as the remaining items, giving you the full Step 2 form. And it's generated through our online system, Skills One, so that you have a variety of reports to choose from. So we'll talk about the varying aspects of Step 2, why it's unique, how it can help you with development for leaderships, teams, conflict, communication, all of the different aspects of working with individuals using their innate preferences, and how you can focus on development, helping people understand why they might be unique, and really developing a deeper understanding of someone's personality type. So we'll start looking at the issues that really help people better understand their type when they're using Step 2 results. So as we all know, we may have certain characteristics about ourselves that might not completely be explained through your Step 1 result. So those of you that have gone through a basic Step 1 interpretation and you read your Introduction to Type description, you might find that there are some particular comments or ideas that you feel do not describe you exactly. So when Step 2 became commonly used in development, we saw that this really helped to answer a lot of those questions. Another benefit we see, someone has a low PCI, which is your Preference Clarity Index, or the PCC, the Preference Clarity Category. If that is low on your Step 1 result, people may have an unclear preference. So what that means is they cannot confidently say that they know what their innate preferences are. They might be having difficulty determining their best fit type. So Step 2 really helps to clarify and highlight some of those differences. And the third benefit, as we see these differences and they show up with a low PCI or low Preference Clarity Category, we often try to determine why might two ENFPs or two ESTJs have some characteristics that could be very different from one another. And we find through our research and looking at different behaviors that often our environment will impact what actually shows up. So we're born with certain personality preferences that are innate to us. And throughout our life, whether it's the impact of childhood, how your parents influence your behaviors, work, culture, school, different aspects of our lives will enable us to develop behaviors that we consider learned behaviors. So Step 2 can often highlight these particular characteristics that are unique to you based on the environmental influence. So we'll look at the components of each of these 4 dichotomies. So we have facets with a total of 40, and we'll look at how these may play out for you uniquely with your preference type. And each individual, if you have characteristics that are what we would consider on the other side, it may show that you express your type differently or uniquely than someone of the same type. So we'll look at what would we consider less preferred aspects of your personality and how they might be expressed uniquely. So let's take a look at the definitions. We see the definition in preference result. So if you're looking at a Step 2 report, you will see preferences that fall underneath the overall dichotomy. So if you score between 2 and 5, that's considered in preference or in line with what your natural innate preference would be. If someone scores in this range, they typically will agree with the behaviors that are described. For example, if someone has a preference for extroversion and all of their facet scores are in preference, they likely agree with most of those Step 1 descriptions. Occasionally, you might find that there could be a facet that is closer to the middle, so we'll discuss what that looks like. We consider that a mid-zone result. If you have a 0 or a 1 on either side, this again is not a judgment. In line with the theory for MBTI, there's not a measurement involved. There's not a good or a bad, one better or worse than the other. It's just how clarified you feel, how confident you are that you know what your innate preferences are. So when we see these mid-zone results, the best way to interpret that when you're working with a client is to ask a lot of questions about their situation, about their environment, and have them give an example. When would you use one facet over the other? And by providing these open-ended questions, you're enabling the client to describe their particular use of that facet, and it will help you to prod for questions that can determine it might be a development use. It could be a particular work environment where they have developed the necessity to use one facet in a particular situation versus another situation. The out-of-preference characteristics. So these are results where your facet ranges from 2 to 5 on the other side. So opposite of what we consider your natural preference. It may be for some people that that is how you are different from others of your type. So it could be just a unique expression for you in particular. But we find that commonly people who are looking at developing particular characteristics and they're focusing on their own individual development, either from a coaching endeavor, from leadership development training, or their own environment has forced them to learn skills that are necessary for their particular uses. So we often see this show up, and it's illuminated through step 2 as out-of-preference results. So let's go ahead and dive into some of the questions you submitted and help you to better understand how to use this tool, step 2 results, with your particular clients. So a great question, how do you effectively debrief when there are more out-of-preference facets than there are in-preference facets? Great question, and let's look at E&I as an example. If you have someone who has a preference for extroversion, and they have, let's say, contained or intimate or reflective, those particular facets fall out of preference. So what you first want to answer, they will have a question, how can I have out-of-preference characteristics that appear to be falling opposite of what I have decided is my natural preference? So your first answer needs to be that these do not add up. So if you look at all of the facets and you look at the number of questions that you answered, they do not add up to equal your overall preference pair. And we have some great examples in the manual. If you're looking at the Step 2 manual, you can show exactly the number of items and where the overlap is and where there are items that particularly focus on Step 2 results. So for example, our EI facet scales, you can see that on the initiating and receiving scale, there are 6 questions that will be scored toward your Form M, and 8 of the questions are scored toward Step 2. So there are 2 additional items. So you'll often see very similar results on that particular scale with the overall EI category. But where you start to see differences and where it becomes common that you may see out of preference, if you look at the active and reflective, you see that there are only 2 items that score towards your Form N result. The 4 additional items are strictly for Step 2. So if someone answers 4 items that are opposite of what they have as their natural preference, it's likely that they will be out of preference on that particular facet. So let's look at another example. This is the TF, the thinking and the feeling dichotomy. You can see that questioning and accommodating, for example, 5 questions were created entirely for this facet pair. There were no particular items that would give us the information that we were looking for the questioning and accommodating. So all 5 of those questions are just for the facets. Critical and accepting, you see that only 1 of the 6 items is scoring towards Form N. So here's some very concrete ways that you can explain how can I have more out of preference than I do that line up with my natural preference. So those are some answers, and that comes directly from the Step 2 manual. So another great question that was submitted, what is the best way to define these 40 facet polls in a very succinct way? So let's look at how you can overall explain, if you have someone that shows out of preference characteristics as well as in preference, the best way to explain that simply is to describe that you will have 20 facets that describe your personality characteristics. The other 20, some of them may be out of preference, some of them may be in preference, but those are areas that you might want to focus on for development. So the 20 facets that are not showing up on your particular report, you may want to take a look at that and determine, are these areas that you could learn particular skills so that you can become more flexible in a variety of situations. Another great question. This particular person has seen ENFPs that may have a facet that relates to critical thinking. So they are curious about what patterns might evolve, or what patterns do we see where it's common to have an out-of-preference characteristic. Again, the manual will give us some great examples of what particular facets are common to be out of preference. So let's look at the ENFP, since that is the particular question that was submitted. These are characteristics that are very common that we see out of preference. So for example, the question submitted for critical thinking, we see that 43% of people are out of preference on questioning. So that particular facet would line up with the thinking preference, but we see that nearly half of ENFPs will show up out of preference on questioning. And if you think about the ENFP personality is very naturally curious, so it's common to see questioning show up as something that's out of preference for the ENFP personality type. Another example, we'll look at the ESTJ. So this particular personality type, we have 43% that are out of preference on accommodating. So again, it's a feeling preference facet, and it's common for the ESTJ. Almost half, again, are accommodating. And we see 31% are accepting. So again, very interesting data, and it's helpful if someone wants to see what these patterns are. We'll look at one more example, the ISFP. We have 59%, if you look at the JP dichotomy. Early starting is a J facet, but 59%, so over half of the ISFP personality types in our sample, are out of preference. You think about that particular personality type. So they're often wanting to please others, and while they have personally a preference for perceiving, their desire to please others and make sure that their actions do not impact others, you see very commonly 59% are early starting. So great questions, and the manual is a great reference for you to go directly to these questions when your clients ask these kinds of questions. So let's look at some of the details and the technical data. Again, a lot of the questions that come up you can answer from the interpreter summary. This is the last page of your Step 2 report, the interpretive report. And if you pull this report aside and take the last page, you might not want to share this with your client because it is the more technical information. But it's a great way to really give yourself a heads up as to some of the questions that might come up. For example, the PCI, your Preference Clarity Index, that's related to your Step 1 result. And you see that at the top here. You see the Preference Clarity Index, how clear or how confident the person is that they have selected the right characteristic between the preference pairs. And the bar graph that we have looks at your type compared to others of your type. So the sample here for ISTJ, you see initiating and receiving. The length of that bar graph is the average range of where people scored for that particular type. The bold number is the facet score for this particular Judy sample. If your number, the bold number, lies within the range, then you are within the range of where most people of your type score. If, however, your number is off of the bar graph, that shows your uniqueness or how you might not be as similar as the other, for our example here, ISTJ. So this particular person has a score of 5 on imaginative, and the average range is well within the realistic side. So that shows how our Judy sample here is very unique, an imaginative ISTJ. The Polarity Index is the number at the bottom, and you can see where this number comes from. It is how consistent the person answered in one direction or the other. If someone answers each and every question towards a particular facet, they would receive a score of 100, and that is quite rare. If they split their score each and every time, they would have a score of 0, and that's also very rare. So if you score between 50 and 65 on the Polarity Index, that is the average Polarity Index. So what you're looking for here is a very low score. If someone has a low score, they might have answered the questions randomly. They might have a lot of ambiguity about what their preferences are. So it would give you information and arm you with the ability to ask questions and really help them find their best fit type. The omitted responses will give you the number of items that were skipped. So that's helpful as well to know if the person went through and answered all of the items. Another great question, looking at particular exercises that are going to be helpful with Step 2 compared to Step 1. So we have a lot of great resources that really help you to understand how you can demonstrate the facets and how an individual might be unique for their team. And working with lots of different groups, you will find that you might have in a particular work environment, for example, a manufacturing environment, you might have ISTJs and ESTJs. So on the surface, you feel, well, these people, they really have a lot in common. How can I show their uniqueness? So by using Step 2, you can often highlight their out-of-preference characteristics and use many of the activities that are in our binder. We have a great binder working with the Mbti Step 2 results, and there are lots of great activities for every facet pair to help illuminate some of these differences. For example, let's say that you have a leadership group and they're predominantly ESTJ. You might take a decision that needs to be made amongst these leaders and walk them through a sample decision. But if you have individuals with out-of-preference characteristics, you can show that the feeling preference will be illuminated and will very much impact the decision that is being made. So some great activities with the binder working with Step 2 results that will really help you to show and highlight some of these Step 2 differences. Another great question, how do we introduce Step 2? How do we use this tool in a workshop? Does it take more time than Step 1? And how can we really design a flow for the particular workshop? It definitely takes more time, so a full day is ideal to use Step 2 with a group. And we have a sample agenda, and I'll walk through the sample agenda. If you have a full day, you want to begin by introducing Step 1. And the goal is to make sure that you fully have an introduction to Step 1 before you move into understanding the facets. You don't want to overshadow the importance of helping individuals find their best fit and understand what their natural preferences are. So once you have explored that and people report what their best fit type is, then you can move into looking at the facets, understanding what their in-preference, out-of-preference scores, mid-zone results, and then spend the majority of your time on activities where they actually go through E&I, for example. You can look at where there might be differences and the relationship between their Step 1 and their Step 2 results, and then go through each pair, each preference pair, and do an activity where you're highlighting the differences between the SN facets, the TF, and the JP facets. And the goal throughout is if someone is struggling to find their best fit, going through Step 2 results will often illuminate their particular examples of how their environment may have pulled them into performing or actually showing behaviors that are different than their natural preference. And it's really the understanding of you're born with these innate characteristics, but often you use preferences and you use characteristics that are outside of that natural preference, and that's a good thing. That shows that you are flexible, that you have the ability to work outside of your natural preference. and you think about people that you might know who are very rigid within their type. If they don't have the ability to step outside and use behaviors that are outside their natural preference, they might not be as flexible, and they might not be able to interact as well as someone who has developed preferences that are not necessarily unique for them, but knowing that they can step outside and really be flexible depending on the situation. So making it personal, going through a decision-making style is an example of an activity, and then closing the training by helping to ensure that if someone is still unclear, that you'll follow up and that you'll really make sure that they feel comfortable knowing what their best fit type is. So another great question, if you have a comprehensive leadership development program, how can you build Step 2 into your leadership development program? And this is a great question because you often have something that's already in place, and now you have a tool that can help create a standing from Step 1 to Step 2 and really expanding upon the knowledge that's already part of the culture in your organization. So Step 2 gives you a real practical way to build skill. So if you think about using Step 2, whether it's in a group workshop or as an individual coaching tool, you can look at the information and find ways to work on your own leadership development needs. You might have natural characteristics that you need to learn to leverage and really use these talents that you were born with naturally. So learn to leverage these natural talents. And at the same time, look for areas where you need to develop. As a leader, it's not necessarily your way is the best way. So the best way to lead is to be able to flex to the needs of those that work with you. So if you can learn to flex toward the team member needs, then you will be a better leader. So an example of a leadership activity, if you use the often seen as the Z model, and if you incorporate that into a leadership activity, let's say, for example, we have an ESTJ leader. Without thinking, the gut reaction is to really look at the cost, how do things work, does it really need changing, and those are aspects of the sensing preference. And this leader will also make decisions based on thinking. And they'll think about, do we really need to change things, or is it really impacting the organization? So what's helpful with this is to force yourself outside of your comfort zone. And by forcing yourself outside of your comfort zone, you will make better decisions. It typically takes longer because you're answering questions that you might not necessarily go to naturally. So this sort of walking through the decision-making model will help you to understand that both sides are equally important, and by going through this model, you can have a better decision in the end. Another great question, many of you may have seen the resource. It's called the You book, and this book was developed to give you many practical day-to-day helpful tips so that you can better implement a development plan. So what this does is it goes through each particular type, and there's also a section for Step 2 facets. And you can find a particular facet where you feel that you might need to develop. So for example, behaviors that show up at work, if you have a preference for sensing, you may decide that it's helpful for you to develop the facet of conceptual. So if you need to develop a conceptual aspect, it's not changing who you are, it's just learning to be more flexible. So one way you could do that is to try to look at possible causes to a problem. So what you're trying to learn is how can you come up with many different solutions before you actually impact the decision at the end. So learning to be conceptual, you continue to explore different solutions, different causes, and try to identify different ways that you can go about implementing a decision. So the U-Book is a great resource, really helping you to focus on practical aspects of things that you need to do at work and how you can make the MBTI very, very work-related. So really maximizing those development opportunities. You can also link it to feedback you might have received by others throughout the organization. So if someone gives you some particular feedback, you can go to the U-Book, find the chapter, find the particular facet, and look for practical step-by-step ways to develop that particular facet. So we're going to talk about now a particular case study. And I think this will help you to see real-life examples of the types of people that you may be working with and how difficult it can be for individuals to really look at this feedback and take it to the next level. So it's one thing to look at a step 1 report and see where your preferences fall, and to have someone take that and really walk through some steps to finding their best fit. But when you have step 2 results, it really gives you a deeper understanding of what's going on behind the scenes that you might not necessarily see through step 1. So for example, and I've changed the name to protect the identity of this particular person, but Sam is an individual who was a person who at first glance identified ISTJ. So you can see Sam sample ISTJ. And that was the 4-letter preference that Sam identified. But as we walked through and I was interpreting Sam's results, you can see on sensing and intuition, we have mostly mid-zone and 1 sensing facet. And Sam described himself as someone who worked hard throughout his whole life and has been very successful in his field. He worked in a manufacturing environment and has always been very diligent, making sure he dots the I's, crosses the T's, makes sure that he exceeds the expectations of others. But at the end of the day, Sam described his environment as being stressful. And he also used an example that I thought was very illuminating. He described his life at work as being on stage. And at the end of the day, he could relax and stop performing. And to me, that's a very powerful statement about someone who every moment of their day, they feel as if they are performing and that they are on stage. So I started asking Sam some questions about if he really wanted to change careers, or if on the weekend he had a hobby he would like to explore, to give me some examples of what those might be. And he started describing his interest in art and music, but he very much downplayed how important they were. But you could see his face light up as he described these activities, and I asked him, if you won the lottery and you didn't have to go to work every day, what would you do? Well, he described wanting to start his own business and move into design and move away from the implementation and the actual day-to-day operations that he's so responsible for at work. So what was happening is we started really uncovering what Sam's natural preference is. And he didn't really realize that you could be very successful in your day-to-day environment and they be learned behaviors. So Sam was starting to uncover this natural preference for intuition, despite the fact that throughout his childhood and his culture and what was being reinforced and rewarded at work, he has a natural preference for intuition, but he was being rewarded for showing sensing. So as you can see on his step 2 results, he is being pulled, being in the mid-zone and showing up. He had a very traditional culture, so that definitely showed up in his results. But his natural preference was for intuition. He was just not rewarded for that in his day-to-day living. So you could start to see his eyes light up and some of the weight being lifted from his shoulders. So then we took a look at his thinking and his feeling facets. And again, you'll look at this and you'll say, wow, again, another example of someone who might have an environment where their natural preference are not always rewarded. So you can see he has validated overall thinking as his natural preference, but on the step 2, we see these out-of-preference results that are showing up. He wants to be accommodating, accepting. He often makes his decisions tender versus tough, and those are preferences, or those are characteristics of the feeling preference. So again, throughout this discussion in the coaching session with Sam, he said at work, as a manager, he has to be logical and reasonable. And often it's uncomfortable for him to make these tough decisions about his employees' performance. He has learned to do so, and he has become a very effective manager. But he feels torn with the impact on his employees and how some of the decisions that his organization has made with layoffs and downsizing, and how traumatizing that has been for him over the many years that he's worked in this organization. So again, we kept talking through this, and by the end of the day, the end of this particular program, this person who had validated ISTJ decided that his natural preference is INFP. So as an example of someone who their environment, their culture, their family has rewarded behaviors that are so very different than their natural preference, he has learned to be on stage and just really be a performer in his day-to-day living. And 3 of those letters he decided were learned as opposed to natural. So in the end, and as a side note, for you as a coach, as a facilitator, you have the ability to go back in and regenerate this report so that you can show the natural validated preference. So Sam decided he's an INFP, but he has many out-of-preference characteristics that he has learned and has become very successful exhibiting particular behaviors in his life. So the learning for him, he won't stop showing behaviors that are outside his natural preference, but he will start using some of his talents that are natural and incorporate that into his life, at work, at home, so he can be more comfortable, he can reduce his stress level, and he can enjoy life. And as a manager, as someone who is required to behave in a particular way, you can see working with your clients how many people struggle finding their best fit. And overall, the step 2 does a fantastic job at showing you what some of these struggles are for people, what some of these learned behaviors are, and how you can help someone identify what their natural preferences truly are, and then use this for further development. How can they learn to leverage some of their natural talents and really help them enjoy life and reduce some of the stress level that they may have? So the step 2 has been a great tool for so many people to really deepen their understanding about themselves, about what their preferences are, and to learn ways to be more flexible so that given a situation, you know when to work within your natural preference, you know when to step outside of your natural preference, and overall to be a more effective person. So I'm going to pass back over to my colleagues at CPP and look at what some of these continued learning opportunities are.
Great. Thank you so much, Sherrie. We are receiving quite a few questions from the audience. So I'm going to quickly let you all know about some of the resources that are available to you, and then we'll move into asking Sherrie some additional questions. First, we'd like to make sure that you're all aware that we do have an MBTI Step 2 training program. We first launched this program in December of last year, and it's sold out. So we've decided to add 2 more sessions that are available to those who might be interested in both Chicago and Nashville. And you can go online and check out, we may be adding another date in the fall. So depending on the kind of response we get and where people are located, we can add additional locations. So if that's something that interests you, please take a look. It's a 1-day training, but you will walk away with a very thorough knowledge of the Step 2 tool. And I also want to make you aware of some of the MBTI Step 2 resources that I think contain answers to a lot of the questions that I'm seeing come through now. So in particular, we had a question about, what are the best ways to describe and distinctly define the facet poles? Well, there are 40 of them, as Sherrie mentioned, and it's hard. I know for a fact I don't have them all memorized. I believe Sherrie does. But we do have that type of information available to you in the MBTI Step 2 User's Guide. It's a fairly new resource, so some of you may not be aware of it. It came out earlier last year, but there are many different resources in there, including several pages that go through the definitions for each of the poles for in preference, out of preference, as well as mid-zone. So I just want to make sure you're aware of these different resources. The manual contains information about the samples. The Working with Step 2 Results Binder provides you with everything you need to get workshops up and going with all the different activities. And then, of course, the client booklet, Understanding Your MBTI Step 2 Results, is a nice tool that you can use when you're doing one-on-one coaching to make sure that folks understand both the preferences as well as the facets. I also want to make you aware of the MBTI Step 2 Manual Supplement. It's complimentary. It's a free tool. It's the supplement to the current MBTI Step 2 manual. So as we have further research and further data to report, we will do so through these manual supplements. And you can find them both for Step 2 and Form M on the cpp.com site on the URL that's provided here, /MBTI validity. Let me quickly let you know about a promotion we're running. For those of you who are interested, we would like to extend additional coaching, 20-minute coaching sessions to the first 30 who are actively using and looking to put on a Step 2 training or coaching session, series of coaching sessions, or an event. So we'd like for those of you who are interested and are purchasing or plan to purchase to let us know by using the promo code you see here, Step 2. Please call in your orders in order to qualify, because our CR team, our customer relations team, does need to process that for you. But then they'll put you on the list to receive a coaching session. And on March 15th, we will reach out to those 30 individuals and get them scheduled with either Sherrie or Pam. And they will be happy to help you through any specific questions you have, or just make sure that you're on track for the training or the different interventions that you have planned. Okay, so now I'm going to move into some of these questions. You all have submitted a bunch of really good questions. And Sherrie, there are a lot of questions that are about activities. Now, I know I mentioned we have the binder, but given your experience and expertise, we're wondering when it's appropriate to use the Step 2 assessment for team building, and if you have any particular activities that are your favorites or that you've heard from those who've left the certification program, for example, are working really well in their organizations for team building.
Yes, and as Jennifer mentioned, many of these activities, if you're trying to capture the step-by-step instructions, they have the PowerPoint slides, the handouts, and everything included in the binder. But one particular activity that I find very helpful working with teams, and often you will have, as I mentioned, a particular group in an organization where you have teams that are very similar with their Step 1 results. So what you're attempting to do is show the differences within their Step 2 results. And there's an activity that I use frequently. If you have a group where you need to create a hypothetical decision, you can walk through this decision, but it's ideal if you have a real decision that this team needs to make. So, for example, to give you a hypothetical, if you have a group of managers and they need to cut the team's budget by 20%, you start out and you split the group into the first preference pair for thinking and feeling. So you will go through and you will have half the group, if you have a 50% split, on one side and half on the other. Or you may see that a majority of people fall under the T side, and maybe you have a small group on the F side. So basically, you're walking through a decision that has to be made, and step by step, you move people through the various facets so that you can see how their comments may be different, what their gut reactions are, and how the process would be very different from one side to the next. And the learning point is we all have to work together to make decisions, and ultimately a decision is a better decision if we do look at the opposing viewpoints. So at the very end, the last facet is tough and tender, implementation of a decision, and you can see those that have a facet of tough would be inclined to pull the Band-Aid off compared to gently discussing the implementation. So that's a great activity. And again, many other activities for going through the facet explanations in the binder. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thanks, Sherrie. Another great question that we've received, we have many different individuals in the audience who are using Step 2 for one-on-one coaching. And we've received various different questions that are worded slightly differently, but I think the sum is that individuals are looking for, when they sit down to have a coaching session, how do they set up sort of what the goals for the coaching session are? And they'd like to see those that they are coaching be able to walk away with 1 or 2 or 3 key takeaways from that session. So they'd like some advice from you of, what you would think is the best way to set up for those coaching sessions, manage the expectations, and sort of reinforce the learnings from those sessions.
That's a great question. The best way to tackle that is to start out big picture, talking about the individual goals for this person. So before you really dive into the results of Step 2, I would ask someone that I'm working with, what are some things that you would like to work on? What are some things that you're interested in developing? It might be very clear, my manager has asked that I work on implementation skills, or my manager has asked that I learn to be more strategic, or there might be some things that have already bubbled up from a performance review. They might have administered a 360 in the organization, so they may already come to the table with things that they would like to work on. If that's the case, that would be my starting point. And then through the interpretation of Step 2, you might find that there are some things that are not within their natural preference. For example, if someone has a preference for S and their manager has asked that they learn to be more involved in strategic planning, then that gives you some practical ways to focus on intuition and really learn to step outside of your natural preference and find some ways to develop those particular facets. But if someone, on the other hand, does not come to the table or sit down with you with an idea of what they need to work on, then the starting point could be your Step 2 results. Looking at if there are any out of preference or mid-zone characteristics, ask for examples of when would you use this particular behavior. And it might show up in ways that they're not as comfortable, or they feel they're having to work harder, or things that might be stressful for them in their work environment. So identifying what appears to be the most important areas for development. And even if someone has all in preference characteristics, you'll still be able to find through discussion what are the most important parts of your job that you need to develop, whether it's a natural preference that's been previously unused, or if it's something that's out of preference on the opposite side. So first step would be working with predetermined development needs, and moving from there to focusing on what shows up in your Step 2 results that you could link to behaviors that could be very beneficial for you in your job, whether you're looking at moving into a management role, whether you've been identified as a high potential employee, but linking it to actual behaviors that you need to exhibit on the job.
Sherrie, we've received an interesting question around determining whether or not Step 2 is appropriate based on someone's age. So, for example, if they don't have a lot of work experience, if they're in their late teens, early 20s, do you believe that the Step 2 instrument is an appropriate tool?
It is very appropriate, and we have validated from age 14 and above, and our research shows that it's highly reliable with anyone within that age group, 14 and above. And the most important thing to keep in mind, regardless of your age, if you have a young teenager or if you have someone who's more mature and has a lot of work experience, is setting the proper mindset. And the reason that's so important, and for your particular question with a younger person, a younger teenager, if they're answering the questions feeling as if someone will judge their results, you will not get an accurate result. So if you have a young teenager in high school and they feel that their parents or a high school counselor or someone is expecting certain things of them, they will answer the questions in a way that they will try to produce the desired result. So setting the proper mindset is the single most important thing that you can do to get an accurate result regardless of someone's age. For example, if someone is young, they're trying to decide what they'd like to do in their life, what career they should choose, what college major they want to pursue, you need to help them understand that there's not a right or a wrong answer, and the goal is to identify what your natural preferences are. And that can be accomplished at any age.
Great. Thanks, Sherrie. We're also getting some questions around, I believe that the crux of it is really how do you help somebody determine best fit type? So if you've got a profile that's a little odd, maybe there's a lot of mid-zone, or somebody's working through the process that perhaps, you know, they scored, their reported type is ENTP, but they're really, you're kind of through the discussion appears that maybe they are ENFP. Can you talk a little bit about how you coach clients through that and the language that you use in terms of helping them, this is the audience members' language, make the decision to switch to the other dichotomy? So basically, how do you help them verify type when you have so much information that's being provided in the Step 2 report?
Okay, and that's a great question. The first part of my answer is going to be setting up, before they ever answer the questions, the proper mindset, similar to what I just referenced with the age question. If someone is provided the assessment and they feel that the results could be used against them, then they're going to answer based on what is rewarded, accepted, or what their actual behaviors are. So the single most important way to help them find their best fit type is to have a good administration in the beginning. They need to understand that what we're trying to identify here are their natural preferences. And often our work environment, we are exhibiting behaviors that might not necessarily line up with our natural preferences. So what we'll ultimately compare to help them find their best fit type are your actual behaviors versus your natural preference. So by setting up the mindset to answer as you would prefer, not necessarily your actual behaviors, which could be different than what you prefer. So as you're answering the questions, think about, of the choices you're providing, which one would you prefer if there's not an environmental influence. So that's the first step, is to make sure you have a good administration. Given that, you might still have someone that has out of preference characteristics, mid-zones, ask lots of questions about what is rewarded in your environment. Talk about their responsibilities at work, versus things that they might do if they had an opportunity to relax and enjoy time on their own without influence of others. And one question that I've asked, which has actually helped quite a few people, is to go all the way back to your childhood. And this example was a woman who verified ENTJ, and she was very certain. But I could tell that her E and her I, she was not quite 100% certain. So I asked her, what did you get in trouble for as a child? And all of a sudden her face was lighting up. She said, oh my gosh, I used to get in trouble for closing my door and reading books. That her family rewarded being outside, playing with others, interacting and talking with other children. So she was rewarded for showing extroversion behaviors. So she went through her whole life, was rewarded, very successful as a manager based on these learned behaviors. So that kind of question, and questions along the lines of what did you get in trouble for, can often help identify what you have covered up, which could be your natural preferences. And it may take time if someone wants to make that check mark, make the decision, verify their type. It could take a lot of questions, a lot of reflection about your own life, what has been rewarded, and what have you covered up that might be your natural preference. So great question. Thank you for asking.
All right, Sherrie, we're going to ask one last question because I think we're coming up on the time. But we are still getting a lot of questions around the mid-zone. So specifically, these are the two sort of things that people are wrestling with. If you could give a few examples, and I know you've talked about this throughout the presentation a little bit with Sam's case study, but when you've got somebody who's just scoring, straight down the mid-zone, how do you approach that conversation and make it a comfortable conversation to the extent that you can, as well as productive? And then the second piece of that question, if there is anything to this, do you see, or is there more of a trend to have women score in the mid-zone for reported results?
Okay, so we'll start with the first question. If someone has a lot of mid-zone scores, the usual explanation for that is the mindset was not set up appropriately from the very beginning. And I know it sounds as if I'm giving the same answer for multiple questions, but that really does resolve so many of these issues. For example, if I'm being given instructions to take the assessment, I might think about my actual behaviors, and if I can perform effectively and successfully on both sides, then I will feel very torn when I'm answering those questions. Yes, I can be strategic, or yes, I can be concrete, or yes, I can be tough, and gosh, I can also be tender. So what happens is I'm struggling, and it's pulling me back and forth, and I can do both sides. So what you have to make sure is very clear from the very beginning, you can be successful with learned behaviors, but the MBTI is trying to help you identify your natural preference. So try to answer the questions identifying your natural preference. And in the end, if someone still has a lot of mid-zone scores, even after a good mindset, it's likely that their environment has pulled them so much away from their natural preference that they have difficulty knowing the difference between what is natural and what is learned. So it may take more time to talk about specific examples, think about what is stressful, think about what they really enjoy doing, and over time someone eventually is going to be able to identify what their environment has taught them versus their natural preference. But I have found if I re-administer the assessment with the proper mindset, it will clarify many of these mid-zone results. And the second part of the question, we don't show results for women that have any overwhelming pull towards the mid-zone. Now, we do see culturally in particular parts of the world for T and F, if a woman has a preference for feeling, but they are working in an executive role or a managerial role, they may be pulled towards the T side because those are responsibilities of their job. So you often see that, and again, that directly links back to the mindset. If they're answering the questions in a way that they're showing what they do as opposed to their natural preference, you will see that pull sometimes on the TS scale for women. So make sure that during that administration, you're helping them to identify what their preference is compared to what they might actually perform on the job.
Great. Thank you so much, Sherrie. We appreciate your time today and the time of everybody out in the audience. I know we are just at 10 o'clock, so we're going to sign off, but please note that we will be posting the presentation, as I mentioned, on cpp.com/webinars. You'll be able to find the presentation, any FAQs that we post, as well as the slides. So thank you so much for joining us today, and have a great afternoon.